Hello and welcome to another Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board webisode. I'm Susan Laycock, Executive Director, and today we are joined by Labour Market Consultant Tom Zizys. Tom will be talking about a special project that was funded by the Ontario Trillium Foundation. Welcome, Tom.
Morning.
This Muskoka workforce assessment was a detailed look at the current labour market from both the job seekers and the employer's perspective. The objective was to set out actionable solutions for players in the region. There were a number of key findings discovered as part of this study, and I'm going to let Tom get into those details.
Thank you, Susan. This study began because of work that was being undertaken by the Workforce Planning Board, interviewing employers and finding increasingly, particularly in Muskoka, that employers were citing the difficulty in finding job candidates across the board, across all industries, across all occupations. And so as a result, the purpose of the study was to try and understand what is it that were perhaps acting as barriers to residents of Muskoka in terms of accessing these jobs. So there are a number of activities that we undertook. We looked at data analysis, particularly census data from the recent 2016 census. We had interviews with a range of key informants, from individuals who were in economic development offices, to chambers of commerce, to employment service providers or literacy and basic skills agencies. We also undertook focus groups with residents who were engaged either in co-op programs or alternative schools, or were clients of employment services. So we were looking at individuals who were on the cusp of entering the labor market or who were currently looking for employment. We had a survey of residents. There was also a survey that was done of employers that was part of Simcoe Muskoka's general employer survey. And then we also had an advisory committee where we were able to discuss these issues and think through some potential steps forward. So I wanted to kind of just give a few highlights of some of our findings and then discuss those recommendations. So in terms of the data itself, overall what the data showed, we wanted to first look at the demographics of Muskoka. And what we saw, and which I think was quite well known to people who live in Muskoka, is that it is a population that is aging. And it's not only the individuals who are in the community, but it attracts a significant number of migrants coming from the rest of Ontario to move to Muskoka to settle there in anticipation of retirement. So it's not so much that it's people who might be 65 years and older who are moving to Muskoka, but it's kind of the pre-retirement group from 45 to 64 years old, more or less. On the other hand, it doesn't attract new immigrants. There's a very, very small number of new immigrants who move to Muskoka, and that has been the pattern for the last 15 years or more. Now, at the same time, in addition to this resident population, you have a seasonal population. Muskoka is well known as a cottage country, and it attracts not only many cottagers during the summer, but also visitors who are coming to stay with those cottagers or with family members who have cottages and so on. So what that means in terms of both that aging population and the cottagers is that you have a large group who are seeking various services, whether it's going to stores to buy food, or going to restaurants, or going to places of entertainment. And on the other hand, but that population doesn't really contribute to the labor force. They're either older or they're just here for holidays. So as a result, you've got a real imbalance in terms of a greater demand for delivering services, having people who can be servers in restaurants or undertake other hospitality functions, but you don't have the corresponding contribution to the labor market to fill those spots. So that's where the real gap occurs in terms of the labor market. It's not as if somehow, you have the population is declining in Muskoka. It's actually increasing, but it's where it's increasing. It's increasing among the older population. These jobs tend to be in a limited number of industries. They tend to be jobs that typically require no more than a high school education. And these jobs also are not especially well paying across the board, whether it's in Ontario or whether in Toronto or wherever you might find these jobs. They're not necessarily well paying jobs. And in Muskoka, those average salaries actually fall somewhat lower than the provincial average. So just to show you what that demographic mix looks like, we have a chart that shows population profiles. So the way to understand these charts is that it shows the age ranges in 5-year increments. The bottom is the youngest age, and then tapering up at the top at the oldest age range as people die. We have less people in those age ranges, and on the chart on underneath Ontario shows the Ontario profile, and what you see is around 2/3 of the way up the chart, you see this bulge, and that bulge is the baby boom generation. It was a large increase in birth rates happening after 1945 and continuing until around 1965, and it worked its way up as that population ages. It works its way up the population pyramid. But beside it, you see Muskoka, and there's a far fewer younger population underneath that bulge. And partly in Ontario, that younger population was filled in by immigration. So people arriving, they're younger. They're coming often with kids, and so that decline in the Ontario birth rate was partly offset by immigration, which wasn't the case in Muskoka. And at the same time, you've got those older adults who are moving to Muskoka, so you've got a much more distorted population pyramid. So in the next slide, we actually look at a few numbers. We show that there's a column entitled migration figures, so it's people who are moving within Canada. It doesn't count immigrants coming from outside of Canada. And it shows that at every age group, apart from a small net decline among 18 and 24-year-olds, that in every age category, in fact, there's more people moving into Muskoka than are moving out. So that's the net migrant numbers. But where the big figures are in that 45 to 64-year range, where you see there's over 1,700 people over a 5-year period, a net increase in that population. But the other column beside it shows the change in population. And there you do see declines in numbers, because even with migration, just as the population is aging, more people are moving up from younger age categories to older age categories. And where the large net increase in the Muskoka population is among the 65 and older population, where they had a net increase in the last 5 years of over 2,800. So that's what we describe in terms of that aging population. The next thing we wanted to draw your attention to is what industries people are employed in. And so this is a standard list of industries, and we've compared Ontario to not only Muskoka, but we also have the data for each of the Muskoka municipalities. We're not going to get into the details here, but we highlighted 4 industries, which are the 4 largest sources of employment for Muskoka. And they much correspond to similar large industries for the rest of Ontario, but in the case of Muskoka, some of the figures are much larger than you have in Ontario. So for example, certainly healthcare and social assistance is a prominent employer across the province, and around 11% of the Muskoka population is employed there, as in the case of Ontario. But where you see the real differences are in 3 other industries: construction, retail trade, and accommodation and food services. Those 3 industries account for roughly around 35% of employment in Muskoka, whereas in the rest of the province, they account for roughly around 25%. So a lot more people employed in just a narrower range of industries. And not surprisingly, the construction industry is catering to the cottagers. The retail trade is catering to larger populations who are buying, whether it's food and provisions for cottages, or whether it's tourism and people coming, getting gear for the summer, or clothing, and certainly the food and accommodation services. The other thing we just wanted to point out was that even with these jobs that exist, there is not great need for higher levels of education, because these jobs, as I mentioned before, tend to have are jobs that require at most a high school education, and sometimes less. But in each category of education, Muskoka residents actually are employed at higher rates than you find in the rest of the province. So this slide here shows for individuals who have either no certificate or high school diploma, apprenticeship, college, or university degree, what percentage of that population is actually employed. And we show the figures both for males and for females, and we compare Muskoka population to the rest of Ontario. And in each category, you can see, whether it's by 1% or more, in each category, Muskoka residents are always employed at a higher rate. The difference is because overall, the Muskoka population actually has lower rates of employment. So here there's a kind of an odd mathematical anomaly. The difference is that Muskoka has fewer jobs that employ individuals with a university degree or with a college degree, and it's those categories that overall have higher rates of employment. So Muskoka residents are seeking out employment that's equivalent to their levels of education. The levels of education of attainment are lower in Muskoka because the jobs don't require much more, because a larger portion of the jobs are in these lower skilled occupations. But individuals are certainly seeking out and engaged in employment in large numbers. The other thing we wanted to just touch base on a bit is not only the data, but also some of the qualitative information. And what I'm going to refer to next are some summaries we have from prior interviews with employers, and also some of the themes that emerged from the focus groups. So this slide shows a few of the main points that emerge. Employers, essentially, as we said at the beginning, really having a hard time finding job seekers, and feeling from their perspective that job seekers oftentimes didn't seem particularly committed to employment. They might be scheduled for an interview and they don't show up, or they might be engaged in work and after a few days withdraw and not even give notice. It was kind of a view that the employers were projecting of employees who really weren't committed to work. Then we move over to the focus groups, and we were getting a kind of a different perspective, where there was a view that individuals felt they weren't particularly respected as employees. That they felt that sometimes they would have challenges that were external to employment, whether it might be something around transportation or getting childcare, and these were issues that weren't necessarily understood, particularly by the supervisors. In fact, it was interesting that residents were often saying, I like the owner. It's just that my direct supervisor just is kind of someone I have a difficult time explaining what my needs might be, and it kind of painted a picture for us less so around labor market numbers, as much around kind of the quality of relationships that exist in the workplace that have to do with both employees perhaps understanding some of the needs and pressures that their bosses are under, but also supervisors perhaps engaging in better human resources practices and better management practices. So we thought that, in terms of an intervention, there might be some opportunities here. All that is to kind of lead into what some of the recommendations were. So we have a number of slides here. The first one really is to kind of make the case that the solutions to these challenges of what appear to be labor market shortages, in our view, really can be found within Muskoka. That we have the range of stakeholders and players in terms of actually a significant number of individuals who can be drawn into the labor market. There's not an absolute shortage of individuals. There are individuals who are unemployed or perhaps who are out of the labor market for one reason or another, and they could be a pool that, in our view, has not been fully tapped. But at the same time, we have a number of services. We have employment services. We have literacy and basic skills services. We have the school system. All of which have capacities to contribute to supporting individuals to make the transition into the workplace. And oftentimes these various institutions have programs and budgets where the resources exist to be able to provide that support. The challenge is how to make it happen, and part of that really has to do with getting these different sectors, the different groups, to work together more productively. So, in our view, kind of the basic element of this strategy on the next slide is to try and increase the participation rates of Muskoka residents. Partly what that means is getting services to be able to outreach more and draw more individuals into the services, but it also means those services and schools, for example, working with employers more closely, so that employers both know what's available that can assist them in terms of finding and preparing individuals for employment, but also in terms of helping them retain employees in jobs. Now, there are other issues that also need to be addressed that are kind of outside the labor market, but we think what would be useful would be to be able to provide a platform where these various stakeholders can come together to sort out and collaborate around solutions that are very Muskoka specific. So one of the things that we proposed was what we called a Muskoka employment partnership. And what this means is kind of a process of a place where the various stakeholders who have an interest in the Muskoka labor market would come together at least once a year to perhaps spend a day to talk about what the current issues are, to learn about each other's issues, so that employers can be very clear about what kind of occupations they're finding it difficult to find workers in, what kind of skills they're looking for, not only kind of the work skills, but also what are the people skills, the soft skills that they expect of employees. And at the same time, a place where other stakeholders can engage with employers to get some of their needs met. For example, schools are often looking for experiential learning opportunities for students. So whether that be co-op placements or internships or even tours of workplaces, having this kind of forum would allow for more relationships to be established between these different services and a wider range of employers. These kinds of initiatives, though, do require a certain amount of organization. And so we propose for something like this kind of partnership that it would be important that they not only meet once, but that there would be working groups that would meet in between these larger meetings, and that there would be a small staff that would be available that could facilitate this to ensure that these meetings take place, that there's follow through, that if there's research that has to be done in between meetings, that this happens, because everyone is so busy. Employers are very busy. These agencies that are providing services are busy, and so it's really important that they have some assistance in order to achieve some of these goals. The other thing we thought that would be really helpful would be to actually develop a database of all employers who are present in Muskoka. So we know not only what industry they're in, but also what occupations they employ individuals in. It can serve, again, as a platform to identify opportunities for experiential learning, to be able to communicate with employers, to learn about when there are job openings, to have a more systemic way of both publicizing job openings and also drawing people to one database in order to understand where the openings are, and to do the matchmaking that could take place. This would be a great asset, particularly for high schools and for Georgian College. And then finally, we felt that another important piece of the puzzle is to be able to provide support to employers. It's partly having to do with the follow up to this database, which is to assist in the recruitment process, but further to provide resources to employers, especially around training for workers who are coming into the workforce, workers or residents who might be coming from different population groups where supervisors need to learn about perhaps better engagement practices with youth, or older adults who are staying in the labor market in Muskoka, or women who have young children and have special needs in terms of childcare responsibilities. And also perhaps layering onto that training around HR practices and better ways in which to engage with employees so that they feel like going the extra distance with their employer, and to instill kind of better relationships to support longer term job retention. Now, all that being said, we also feel, and we heard very strongly from both range of stakeholders as well as residents, that there are a lot of other issues that need to be addressed. Certainly transportation, concerns about the cost of housing, so access to affordable housing, access to childcare. And we felt that perhaps, getting started on something like a Muskoka employment partnership would provide that place where stakeholders in working on labor force issues might also find the kind of success that would allow them to tackle some of these broader issues that are community wide. So that in a nutshell is both what were the findings and what were the recommendations for this report. We think these kinds of studies are obviously very specific to a particular location, but we think the kind of process that was engaged in, the ability to do a lot of data collection, to do a lot of consultation, is something that could be a valuable precedent for other communities that have their own labor market challenges and would want to find ways to address them. So that's the report.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for hearing. And I know these were very brief highlights. There's a lot of information in the final report for this project, which is going to be available in PDF format on our website. So just go to SMWDB.com and click on the Publications Library tab. Thanks again for joining us today, and be sure to watch for announcements of future Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board webisodes. Thanks again. Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome.